whether you're on YouTube or the podcast platforms and all that. Someone said to me during the week actually about the podcast platforms that I should be saying, if you like the podcast, you should give us a rating or something like that. So I said it. Thanks for your support, obviously, on Instagram and Facebook and all those other things. And a big thanks to Conor Ruach for coming on last week to talk about spirituality, introducing the Irish language to spirituality, which was something that, was completely new to me. So I learned a lot of that episode. And Conor had a great manner about him, very calming, which is very important. But anyway, let's get on with this week. I want to introduce my guest today. He's a professor of history at, I think I've mispronounced this in my head, Joliet Junior College in Illinois, and he's the author of Joy and Fear, The Beatles, Chicago in the 1960s. John Lyons, how are you doing?
Hello, Derek. I'm doing very well. I will pronounce the name just so we can get it right. Mm-hmm. Joliet Junior College.
I wasn't even close, you know that? Because
you were close. You had Joliet.
I was doing that thing where the French wouldn't pronounce the T at one point, and I was like, Joliet.
No, we pretty much in America, we do say Joliet, and it's obviously named after the French explorer. So,
see, there already learning, John. Yeah. I want to say
anything you learn on this podcast, but
I don't know about that. But I want to also say, with kind of behind the scenes thing, John is a very happy man today. He's a big City fan. They just thumped Manchester United 6-3. I think we're all happy about it, to be honest.
I think most of the world is happy at this. I can't imagine many people who are unhappy at Man United getting trounced.
Yes, I agree 100%. John, we always start in the same area. Could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
Yes, I was actually, my parents are from Ireland, mm-hmm. and they're from west of Ireland, Cork and Mayo, rural Ireland. And they moved to England in the interwar period. And they met in England, got married. And I've got a brother, older brother, and an older sister. And we were brought up in North London. Mm-hmm. And I went to Catholic schools. My secondary school was all-boys school, and it was run by Christian brothers. You probably are familiar with Christian brothers, but for those that aren't, they usually send a shiver up the spine for those that have had any contact with them. And so anyway, that gives you an idea. So I hope my students aren't listening to this, because I didn't do very well at school at all. I did very badly. And so I left as soon as I could when I was 16. And I was a welder for 12 years in construction. And then I actually went to college pretty late. I went to college when I was 28. And I went to college in Manchester. And the reason for that is obvious from what you said earlier. So I could go and see Man City play every week. Great educational reason to go to college. Yeah. But anyway, and then when I was there, I was doing a degree in the social sciences. So I was doing history, politics, sociology and economics. And then one year we did a student exchange, and the student exchange was to Detroit. So I lived in Detroit for a year, and I was in a history class. It was a US history class. And who should I meet but my wife, my future wife, I should say. And so I came back to the UK, and I did a master's degree at Warwick University. And then I moved to America to do my PhD. And I did that in Chicago. So we lived in Chicago. And when I finished my PhD, I got this job in Joliet Junior College, and I teach their American and British history. So that's
a very
history.
Yeah.
Was that thorough? I thought that I'll go.
No, but I like the span from where your parents came from, that we don't normally get that kind of, thoroughness. Is that a word? Yeah, I guess.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, Derek.
That's all right.
I see myself as being reasonably thorough.
It's fair.
But yeah, I mean, it's a strange combination, because I got Irish parents, and then I was born and brought up in England, and now I've lived basically half my life in America. So, I have a commitment to the three places, really.
Yeah.
But I always remember when I was younger, being brought up in London, we had a lot of Irish. We used to go to Ireland every couple of years. We had a lot of Irish relatives. And of course, they used to call me the Plastic Paddy.
It's a great nickname, isn't it?
I'm not sure it's PC these days to say that.
I think only Irish people. Yeah, I mean, Irish people or people with an Irish lineage can say it, but I don't know anybody else outside of that can.
Right, gotcha.
So you're fine.
But you get the idea. I mean, they kind of. I wasn't really Irish, but then of course, when you live in England and you're surrounded by Irish people, you go to Catholic church, Catholic schools. You're not really English either.
Yeah.
So, and then I come to America and I'm not American.
Yeah.
So I don't know where I fit in.
You're a wandering star. But maybe. Listen, maybe. But listen, could you, like, this is another question we always ask and we find really great answers and kind of varied answers. When did you first become aware of mental health?
Well, again, my parents were from rural Ireland, brought up in the interwar period. They come to England, and the thing that they really are happy about is that they have a job and a home, a house. And so I never even, I don't think I even heard the word depressed or people saying that I had anxiety when I was growing up in London. It just wasn't on the agenda. And, it's partly because, again, Irish working class families, they're not exactly known for talking about their mental health issues. Usually you say, Dad, I feel a bit anxious today. It is like, shut up, you Egypt.
Yeah.
That's the kind of response. And also, of course, then the culture in Britain doesn't help because, Britain does have this sort of stoic sort of culture, the stiff upper lip, carry on, keep calm and carry on, that kind of. So it wasn't really around me at all, sort of people talking about mental health issues. But I always knew that they were certainly more advanced about this in America. Would you agree with that? I think that's true. And of course, the one person that I always think about as introducing me to mental health issues was Woody Allen. I used to love Woody Allen films. And of course, he always was suffering from some kind of mental health issues. And he was seeing a therapist always in the film. And so anyway, so that it was always America that was the place that had the mental health, structure. So anyway, so when I came to America, that's pretty much true. I came here to go to college. And it was the first time where I came across a much more sort of sympathy about mental health issues. And to give you an example, the college I work in now, we have a disabilities department that basically deals with these sort of issues. And we have wellness programs for the students. I have a lot of students that get certain accommodations because they have, anxiety or depression or whatever. Some of them can't stay in the classroom. They have to leave for a while. Some people have different learning styles that we have to adapt to. So I'm very aware of sort of like mental health issues now. And of course, the college I teach in, probably the nearest I could say that, that you'd know what a community college is. It's basically like a further education college. Mm-hmm. So my students are either going to be welders, nurses, car mechanics, or else they're going to then go on to university. So it's like a step before they go to university. So a lot of my students come from working class backgrounds, first generation college students, and they've got to juggle, their studies, their families, with all the issues that come with that. And then, of course, most of them are working. A vast majority of my students are working. And I teach classes at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I have students come in late for an 8 o'clock class. And of course, you say to them, how comes you come in late? Because you've got to be on time. And of course, they're working in a restaurant or a bar until 1 o'clock in the morning and then coming into college. So obviously, I can visibly see with my students that there is a lot of issues about mental health and just juggling the lifestyles that they live. Yeah. And of course, the pandemic made it even worse because when we were during the pandemic, we were all online. And so everybody was isolated in their houses and, the issues that sort of brings up about lack of socialization. And again, maybe you know more about this, Derek, but I do get the impression that the students today or young people today are not socializing as much as they were years ago in the sense of social media or I don't really know exactly if that's the only issue, but there does seem to be less socializing with students, and that can cause problems as well. Do you agree with that? I mean, I don't know.
No, absolutely. I do agree with that. I think there's a lot to to be said for social media, of course, but obviously to do with like gaming is a big thing as well. And, I agree also with what you said about America being ahead of us with regards to mental health, because they did talk about Woody Allen's a great example. everybody had an analyst or
Exactly.
And it was, even when I started watching things like Woody Allen films, I didn't even know what an analyst was. I did.
Yeah.
And so we are still catching up. I think we're catching up as well as over in Ireland and Great Britain. We're slowly getting better at coming out and talking about it. I think the Americans are definitely way ahead of us with that. They'll be much more upfront, which it freaks Irish people out a little bit that they're so upfront.
We used to laugh at the Americans for it.
Yeah.
That's always, they were sort of like they're always saying therapists.
Yeah.
But once you're surrounded by, and like I say, in a college, you do see that people have anxiety, obviously, about doing exams, about getting grades, about having money to go to college. The basic stuff is causing a lot of anxiety. So I can see it in all my students. And like I say, we do get these forms that from certain students that tell you about accommodations that they need.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can obviously see that some of them are having issues about enormous anxiety before exams, about socializing with other students, being in a room of 30 students. It's kind of pretty overwhelming after you've been at home for 2 years, in the bedroom. Yeah. And so we're dealing with all them sort of issues with the students.
Yeah. Well, at least, there's that, they're being forthcoming about what it is they're having issues with and stuff. And hopefully this is going to happen over here. I may already do. I mean, obviously I'm out of the loop with regards to college, but I wanted to ask you about what appealed to you about history as a subject.
Well, I think I was always interested in the sort of world around me. So like I say, when I went to do my degree, it was in the social sciences. So I'm doing about economics, politics, sociology and history. But I became aware, and again, this is no offense to political scientists that are in my department or sociologists, but those subjects really, they're a bit limiting. But in terms of history, as I tell my students, it's basically the study of everything. I mean, there's nothing, even what we're talking now about mental health, if you're interested in that, that's history, the history of mental health. Any topic, and again, at the beginning of the semester in Joliet Junior College, I always ask my students, what figure in US history or British history they most admire. And it's just to get them to sort of talk and, sort of warm them up a bit. But I always say to them, when you think about a famous person that you admire, it could be anything. It could be somebody who's a politician. It could be somebody who's a writer. It could be somebody who's into sports. It's somebody that's a musician. It could be anything, and that's the thing about history. It's the study of everything. And you can't understand the world we live in unless you understand history. Now, I understand we need, obviously, political science, sociology, economics as well. But I think they're a bit more limiting in their range. And also what I like about history is that hopefully when you're writing history, it's also, it's a literary, it's artistic. You've got to put over a story. You've got to put over an argument. But I think, again, in some of those other top subjects, they're less interested in engaging people with the prose, and they're just trying to get their sort of data across. And I like that about history as well, that you can use it as kind of just telling stories.
I agree. I found that we'll talk about your book, and I've read about, I love history myself, and I'll read a lot of history books if I can, but there's a huge difference in how we respond to it on the page, because like you said, if there's you obviously want the facts, but there has to be like a narrative, and there has to be, something that grabs hold of you. But then there's these really dry history books where it's very, very difficult, I think, to kind of grasp onto something. And I wanted to ask, there's something, and this is again laughing at the Americans as we used to do, well, maybe still do, I don't know. But how do you find, because you've experienced learning over in Britain about how the way history is taught there, we often think of America as being limited to only teaching American history. Is that like a misconception that we seem to have over here?
Yeah, no, I think that's not true. I mean, obviously there's a core sort of history that most Americans learn, and that would be US history. And in some ways, there has been a problem with that in the past, that US history means 1607 is when the English land in Jamestown, Virginia, and that's when the class starts. But of course, we now are much better at teaching US history in America, but because we go further back and talk about the Native Americans that were here. American history goes back hundreds, thousands of years. It's not just 1607. So there is that angle. But so that US history, obviously, they do learn that in schools. And the other thing they learn a lot is world history. That's becoming very, very popular in the last few. And I teach that as well. I have taught that for the last 20 odd years. And also they learn a lot there's a class in America that's called Western Civilization, which is not a great name, but it's basically the history of Western Europe.
Yeah.
Plus the places where Western Europeans went to. So, we teach that class well. So, no, I think there is a wide variety of classes. I think one difference between in the UK and in America is that in the UK, the teacher of history is kind of very episodic. You learn something deeply. British people may be learning about sort of like Alfred the Great, and then you move on to 1066, and then you move on to Adolf Hitler. While in America, they do these big survey classes where you cover basically everything from, like I say, 1607 or whatever the class may be. Well, I teach a British history class, which is 1689 up to the present.
Okay.
Kind of cover pretty much, or supposed to cover all the major events in there. I don't think you'd really get that in the UK. It'd be much more choppy and much more, cut down into different little micro topics. But in America, it's much more of a survey.
Right. How important has the city of Chicago been to or for America's history?
Well, of course, maybe you know this, but we do actually call Chicago Island on the Lake.
Yeah, I've heard that. Nice.
Chicago's on Lake Michigan, southwest of Lake Michigan. And it is also often known as the flyover city because it's really, if you come to America, you really visit the East Coast, New York, maybe Boston or whatever, down to Florida, or else then you go to the West Coast to visit LA, Hollywood, and then California up to San Francisco. So Chicago's kind of like that, like a flyover city. And so therefore it always had the reputation of being America's second city.
Yeah.
And that's because it was the second biggest to New York, but it was also seen as being in the shadow of New York. And I don't know, again, maybe you know this, but a lot of people call Chicago the Windy City.
Yeah, and I was, do you know what, John? I was actually there for a matter of hours. I went up to Sears Tower. I hated it because I don't like heights. Came back down and kind of left. But I do remember it being quite windy.
Well, that's true, but that wasn't the original reason why it was called the Windy City. It was called that by Easterners who said that American politicians and Chicago politicians and business people were always boasting about their city. And so they called it the Windy City. So whenever I hear people coming over here and talk about the wind, there's no wind in Chicago at all compared to any other place I've been anyway. So, but anyway, so it's basically, it's the second city. It's seen as being in the shadow of New York. That's for true. It was, though, built relatively late in American terms after there was a fire in 1871. Great fire in Chicago. And they built then a brand new city and they built the skyscrapers. So you get this modern city that was built on the edge of the lake. And as you probably noticed, it does look spectacular, doesn't it? Right on Lake Michigan. We've even got beaches. And then you have these huge skyscrapers that built there. And of course, it had a huge labor movement. May Day started in Chicago. And of course, then a large Irish population comes here. And, it has a large St. Patrick's Day parade. You can get Smithwick's beer here. I don't know if you want it, Eric, but...
No, I wouldn't drink that, but...
No, well, I'm not a big fan of it either. And Guinness is better in Dublin. There's no question about that. But still, you could, there's so many pubs here that are called Oh This or Mac That. And there is St. Patrick's Day, of course, just everybody's Irish, and there's 2 million people on the streets for the parade. Oh, and also we're the city that has come up with that great idea of actually dyeing the river green.
Yeah. So
St. Patrick's Day, the river is green. I'm not sure that's great ecologically nowadays, but anyway, and that's what they do. And in the 20th century, the politics of the city was dominated by the Irish. We've had mayors here with names in the 1930s, Kelly, Edward Kelly, and then of course the Mayor Daley and his son two Mayor Daleys, and the people that ran the city were always called the Irish Mafia.
That's right.
And it's not quite like that today, but still, whenever I get anything in the mail about local elections that are coming up or whatever, you can be damn sure that some of them are called Burke or Matt Nicholas or whatever. In other words, they're still here, very much an Irish presence here. So so it is a very Irish town, got a very Irish presence to it, and it's played a major role. Some of the major events in US history took it. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book about Chicago, obviously, and one of the reasons is because I thought people would be interested in the Beatles story in Chicago. Chicago is where we had again, you probably know, the Democratic National Convention riot place in '68. We had Martin Luther King was here, and he was attacked on the streets. Some of the sort of major sort of figures of 20th century America came to Chicago at one time or another to live here. So it does have that sort of interest, I think, to a wider audience. And of course, Al Capone.
Yeah, very famous. Some people, when I mentioned you were coming on and I mentioned the book with Chicago, that was the kind of the first name that seemed to come to people.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah, and it's...
it's not the reputation Chicago really wants.
No.
When the Beatles came in their first press conference, somebody actually asked them, of course, what did you think of Chicago before you came here? And of course, Paul McCartney basically said gangsters.
Yeah.
Not what the mayor at the time wanted to promote as being... and of course, now we're trying to promote Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
That hopefully people around the world know Chicago because of Michael Jordan, but it doesn't work. It doesn't matter where you go, it's still Al Capone.
I mean, we all know Jordan, but unfortunately, Capone came first. Although he couldn't dunk, apparently. I know. That was a bad joke. John, let me read out an advert, and we're going to get back into it, and we're going to talk a bit more about the Beatles in Chicago. So let me get this one right. So, Fusion Training Center, Monksland, Athlone, a place to train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. Okay, so, John, when did you start, or when did your interest start with the Beatles?
Well, I pretty much grew up with them. I mean, I was growing up in the 60s, and they were everywhere, And so I can't remember. There was never a time, again, in America, there was a TV show called The Ed Sullivan Show that was on in February 1964. And all Americans remember that were around at the time as being their introduction to the Beatles. That was their first live appearance on TV. But in the UK, there was no equivalency, really. You can't really say there was that sort of moment. So it sort of grew, over time. And then 63 obviously broke through massively. And I can remember going to see Help, the film. I can remember seeing the Beatles on the, on the David Frost show, doing Hey Jude, that piece of films, famous piece of film now. I can remember that. I can remember them being on the Top of the Pops, the film from the Apple roof where they were doing Get Back. My brother, I remember buying the first album we had in the house was Abbey Road. First time we had a record player, I think, was in the mid-60s. And I remember having Paperback Writer as one of the first singles we had in the house. So they're always there. I kind of grew up with them, really. And when I started buying my own records when I was a teenager, obviously the Beatles were broken up. And I liked David Bowie, Led Zeppelin. That was the sort of era for that. I like reggae music, dance music. So I like the Beatles along with other groups and musicians. I don't, I'm not one of these that is just kind of fanatical about the Beatles. I like all different types of music, but you can't deny about the influence of the Beatles. To me, that's the, if you're interested in history, I teach British and American history, and you can't really teach both of them without mentioning the Beatles.
Yeah, do you know what was great actually? The tie-in in the book of some people you mentioned as you go along, and the first time that they saw them was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and there's those statistics that you hear about, like there was no crime in New York during this period of time, which is sketchy enough, you know what I mean? But But what I loved about finding out about more stuff about the Beatles was one thing in the book, but finding out about Chicago was really interesting to me. And I couldn't believe that there was such an influence of, well, not that I couldn't believe it because obviously the Irish connection and stuff, but the Catholics within within Chicago, there was certain parts like censorship on the radio, 50s and 60s. And even you mentioned about bands having to re-record songs to put it on the radio, which kind of mind blowing on that one.
Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church was basically huge in Chicago. It had so much influence. It was the largest diocese in the country, so bigger than New York. And they had the ear of City Hall. So obviously all the mayors in Chicago, like I say, that Irish mafia, they're all Catholics, and they were in constant communication with the Catholic Church. And then again, coming from Ireland, you probably wouldn't be too surprised at this, but maybe other people would. That the priests used to have columns in the local newspapers. They write columns, and most of these columns would basically talk about where America has gone wrong. That was they've been writing these columns about America's going to the dogs for about 100 years, but they were certainly writing them in the 60s, these priests. So they had enormous influence, and they also had influence on the radio, what was being played. And like you say, the largest radio station was WLS in the 60s in Chicago, and they were famous for censoring, and some unbelievable stuff. And like you say, there was one record which was, for your listeners, a lot of them probably know it, and that's Van Morrison. Them had a song out called Gloria, and it wasn't a big hit in the Ireland or the UK at the time, but they started to play it in these garage bands in Chicago, started to pick up on it. And there was one band called the Shadows of Night, and they wanted to record a version of it, and they had to change the lyrics. And the lyrics they had to change was because in the lyrics it said, I can't remember the exact words, but along the lines of, "She came to my room."
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Now, I've got a dirty mind, but, obviously people in Chicago, the Catholic Church, had an even dirtier mind than mine, because what they read into that was,
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I do know.
Thanks there, Derek, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know, but I know.
So they had to record the record with different lyrics. And then also, I should have mentioned this when we're on the subject. Believe it or not, WLS banned 3 Beatles records.
Did that happen did the BBC ban "I Am the Walrus"? The line "Let your knickers down"?
Knickers. They didn't like the word knickers. But that was, that was again, the BBC was a little bit heavy on censoring as well. That's true. But in the WLS, they banned "A Day in the Life," because they thought it was about drugs. There was a drug influence in it. And that, again, was banned by the BBC as well. So they probably were both involved in that. And then the Ballad of John and Yoko, because they used the word Christ in it. And then, not a bit directly a Beatles song, but the Plastic Ono band Cold Turkey. They also banned that. So that was 3 records that were banned by WLS. It's like I say, the Catholic Church did have enormous influence. There's no doubt about it. I should mention, Mayor Daley. I mean, he was the mayor of Chicago. He became mayor in 1955, and he died in office in 1976. You think about that, 21 years as mayor, and he'd still be mayor today if he hadn't died. And basically, he was a man who used to get up every morning. He was a staunch, and he used to go to church every morning. And then he'd go to the office, and he'd do his work. And his famous hobbies were going to see the White Sox baseball team. He came from the south side of Chicago, and listening to a nice jaunty Irish song.
Oh,
such as, I don't even know what is a jaunty Irish song. The Dublin, something like that.
Yeah, but John, you talk about someone like Daley, because I had heard of Daley before. Like, he's almost like the most infamous of the mayors of America's 20th century America, I suppose. But for a guy like you say who went to church every day and was did not like the Beatles, he was involved with corruption, suggestions of corruption a number of times, and he did have. What was the line? Was it to which of the Kennedys about when they were looking for some sort of tip off him. He said, get a haircut, which is...
You think about the Bobby Kennedy ran for president in 68. And whenever it's amazing how, powerful Daley was, because he not only did he was called the boss, told you everything. And in Chicago, he obviously owned Chicago, but then he had influence in the Democratic Party in Springfield, the capital of Illinois. So he dominated that. And then also because they had, politicians, senators and that representatives that went to Washington, D.C., he had a big influence in Washington, D.C., in the federal government, And so if you wanted to run for president or run for anything, you had to go and see Mayor Daley and get his okay. And Bobby Kennedy went to see him when he was running in 68. And they had a great chat. And, their common Irish ancestry obviously helped. And then at the end, Bobby Kennedy said to him, to Mayor Daley, is there anything you think I should do? And Mayor Daley says, yeah, I think you should get a haircut.
I mean,
that does sum him up, really, doesn't it, Mayor Daley?
It's nitpicking a little bit. There's certain things that, like, there's still these facts that I come across about the Beatles. And there's one in particular, early 1964, they held the top 5 spots on the Billboard 100. But yet, as you mentioned in the book, they were seen as a danger by cultural traditionists. And it's not just priests, by the way. There's rabbis. It covers a lot of different religions as well.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I wouldn't say surprised me, but I was a little bit surprised at the depth of the opposition to the Beatles, and certainly in Chicago, it came from, all religions. That is very true. And I think that's the thing there is they were worried about the reaction of the girls. Yeah. That they thought that they were more interested in, shall we say, sensual matters rather than spiritual matters. Yeah. And also because the Beatles, they always kept saying they were agnostic. That was whenever they were asked at a press conference, what do you think about religion? They never said they were Christian. And they often criticized the Christian church, not the teachings of Christ, but they did criticize the church. And so they called themselves agnostic. And of course, if you were somebody in America in the 60s, that obviously meant a atheist, So the church didn't like them, or religion in general. And then the second group didn't like them was obviously Mayor Daley and the political establishment. And they didn't like them because they were worried that when they came to Chicago, that they were going to bring unruly behavior with them on the audience. And so what Mayor Daley did was when the Beatles came to Chicago in 64 for their first tour, they wouldn't allow them to stay overnight in the city. So that's why the Beatles flew in at like 4:30 in the afternoon, and they already were on the way flying out to Detroit by 11:30 that night. They're only in the city for 7 hours, and that included a press conference. And the other thing he did then is he didn't want crowds to greet them at the airport. So Mayor Daley came up with a great idea, and that was he'd keep it a secret where they were landing. Yeah. And there's only 2 airports, so it wasn't that secret. But anyway, and then, of course, the press agent for the promoter decided to tell the radio station, WLS, who broadcast it, where they were staying. So Mayor Daley went absolutely nuts. And instead of the Beatles coming into the main airport, which was O'Hare, he got the pilot to divert the plane to Midway Airport, which is why they came into Midway Airport in 64 and not into O'Hare. And he did the same trick in 65, actually. They came in there in 65. But so anyway, that was the second opposition. There was the church, there was Mayor Daley and the establishment. But the third one was the Chicago Tribune. That was our major newspaper in Chicago. And really, it was one of the major newspapers in the country. And it was a Republican newspaper. And so they were the ones that were really worried about the changes that the Beatles were going to bring to America, the cultural changes, that they seemed to be much more liberal. They seemed to be bringing, talking about issues such as civil rights, obviously later on about the war. And so therefore the Tribune was very antagonistic towards the Beatles. And the editor throughout the 60s, his name was W.D. Maxwell, and he wrote one of the first editorials against the Beatles in January 64. This is before the Ed Sullivan Show, where he actually warned the people. He titled the editorial Beatles Menace. So he was warning people about the Beatles. But then the classic one that I always like and is the one where he wrote after the Ed Sullivan Show. So they appeared in the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th. And then he wrote this editorial, and the headline was Human Sheepdogs.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
And then the whole editorial was basically saying about how awful this group was.
Some of the stuff like the from there and Maxwell and stuff, and writing about calling them girls and like hair like girls and stuff. And I wrote out this quote, and this is from a rabbi actually rather than the paper, but they said Antichrist beatniks that could destroy our nation, as Plato warned in his Republic. I mean, they're
slightly over the top. Yeah,
it's a bit over the top. It's and another thing, John, actually, while we're on it, because what I found interesting again, because you talk about Irish Catholics, they look down on them because they were British.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't overplay that too much, because obviously that connection with Ireland was a little bit more tenuous by the 60s, but certainly there was that element in it. The Beatles were seen as being a British band, and they were seen as upholding British values, and therefore there certainly was an element. But of course, as you know, 3 of them are Irish.
Yeah, that's true.
I wouldn't be too, saying that the group were upholding British values.
Yeah, and that.
I do actually. Do you mind if I just read something to you?
Of course, go for it.
Do this on your show, Derek. Are you the sort of show that allows people to read something?
Absolutely, I am.
You are. Okay,
yes,
I'm going to do it because it's such a great quote that I'm doing a speaking tour at the moment. I always use it at the end of my speech, and it's basically from somebody called Jack Riley, who again was part of that Irish mafia, and his job was to put on all the major sort of events, social events that were happening in Chicago. So he was the one that was in charge of the Beatles' visit. It wasn't Mayor Daley. Anyway, and what they used to do is people, whenever they wanted to do anything in Chicago, you wrote to Mayor Daley. That was it. He, that shows you how much power he had, including in early 64, teenagers were writing to Mayor Daley asking him to allow the Beatles to have a show in Chicago. So you can imagine, and then they used to write to him and say, they wanted tickets to the show. Some of them want to meet the Beatles. Some of them want to give them the keys to the city. But they all wrote to Mayor Daley for these things. And then it was Jack Riley, this, again, another Irish American, who would then respond to these mostly girls that wrote to the Mayor Daley. And this is such a great, I've got to read it to you.
Yeah.
This was one where a girl wanted to basically write to Mayor Daley and ask if she could give the Beatles the keys to the city. And he replied, "The Beatles will come to Chicago and the Beatles will leave the next day. The world will not change one bit because of their appearance here and their departure. A year from now, some other entertainer will occupy the spotlight and you will be wondering, who were the Beatles? Faintly remembering you had heard that name somewhere." That was summer of 64. But I think what I like about that quote, it shows you just how out of touch that they were with popular culture.
Yeah.
Like Mayor Daley, he'd go and see the White Sox or might put on an Irish jig, but he really had no clue about popular culture. But one of the things I found out, which again kind of amazed me, is of course, when you're mayor of Chicago or major politician, you can get tickets to any event.
Yeah.
He got tickets to see the Beatles. And he gave them to his sons.
Oh, did he?
Yes, and one of them became mayor later on.
Oh,
so
wow.
That gives you an idea, that the opposition to the Beatles goes so far.
Yeah.
That, he allowed a couple of his sons to go and see the Beatles. But yeah, they were just so out of touch. I think that's the point about a lot of these people, really. They just couldn't see, what was happening.
Yeah, and do you know what this kind of leads on, John, to a brilliant chapter about the increase in sales of instruments from 63 to 65. And like you touched on already, the huge swell of new groups from Chicago.
Yeah. I mean, this is unbelievable, really. I mean, and again, not just Chicago, all around America, but people are inspired to become musicians because of the Beatles. And I think it was because of the Ed Sullivan Show. If you ever see any of that, if any of your listeners ever have a look at some of it's on YouTube, you can look at their appearance. And what they do is they basically just sing their songs. There's no dance routines. You know, they're just smiling. They're having a good time. You know, they're both, you know, it looks, and what teenagers watching at home saw was they saw something that was just so easy.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody could do it. They're having such a great time. They're just a gang of friends. They're up on stage and they've got thousands of girls screaming at them.
Yeah.
You know, of course I'm going to do that. So everybody rushed down and they bought the instruments thinking that, you know, they were going to then form bands. Some of them did form bands, but many of the musicians I spoke to, they all said that once they started to then cover Beatles songs, they realized how difficult it was to play them. You know, the chord structures are not easy to play. And also the harmonies are just so difficult to replicate. And so therefore, luckily enough, in the summer of '64, another group appeared on the scene whose music was a lot easier to play. And I think, you know, who that is, the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of these groups, they're inspired to become musicians and form bands because of the Beatles. But then a lot of the times the music they played was more influenced by the Stones, the Yardbirds, the Animals, because it was a bit easier to play. You could
absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a now I'll let you kind of take this away, but the interesting kind of thing I took from this was when John Lennon gave a famous interview to Maureen Cleave about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus. That's the quote without the context around it. He had to give this very tense kind of press conference in Chicago. Could you just actually maybe just give us a little bit of background on the piece by the journalist, and then, you know, about that actual press conference?
Yeah, I think by early '66, the Beatles were kind of consciously trying to break away from their image, you know, the mop top boy band image. And so they started to give interviews where they're discussing sort of more worldly issues. And in the interview that he gave with Maureen Cleave for the London newspaper, the Evening Standard, he was talking about the decline of religion in the UK, you know, that and it's true. I mean, everybody says that about Britain in the '60s. There was a decline in people going to church, etc. So he made that comment, and it did actually get a little bit more pushback in the UK than kind of, you know, historians have kind of noted since. But it did get bumped, but not that much. And then it started to appear in American newspapers and magazines. And again, a bit of pushback, but not massively, you know, opposition. But then a teenage magazine called Datebook took up on the interviews, and they published them in their journal. And I spoke to the managing editor. His name is Danny Fields. He became famous later on. Well, he's involved in the record industry, but for managing the Ramones. But he was the managing editor of this teen magazine, and he said that he got the interviews from the Beatles. It was actually them that gave it to this teen magazine. They actually had the publisher of the magazine's name's Art Unger. He knew the Beatles, he toured with the Beatles, and so they were kind of friends. So it wasn't as if the magazine was doing anything underhand. It was the Beatles gave them the articles saying, you know, I think it'll suit your audience. Mm-hmm. And again, pushing this new image of the Beatles. So anyway, so they put Paul McCartney on the cover. And the first quote was a quote that Paul McCartney made, a very antagonistic quote about race relations in America from the Maureen Cleave interview. And then underneath it, they put Lennon's quote, which was about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus. So the magazine, he told me that he thought that people would pick up on the Paul McCartney quote. You know, obviously he's on the front cover and that's the first quote. But it was a small radio station in Alabama that actually picked up on the other issue, which was Lennon's quote about religion. And I think it's because there was a lot of anxiety about religion, especially amongst Protestants in early 1960s. You know, there was already a Supreme Court decision about you could no longer say prayers in the public schools. There was now public funding for Catholic schools, which was new. And, you know, there was a lot of articles about the decline in religion in America as well, the power of the Protestant religion. And so I think that's why they picked up on the Lennon quote, and they ran with it, this radio station in Alabama. It was then picked up by other radio stations. And again, a lot of, you know, historians that have written about this sort of picture it as being just a local affair. You know, the Southerners, the Bible Belt were the ones that were angry against Lennon, but it wasn't. It was all over America, and it spread even into Canada, into South Africa. It spread into a lot of places. So it wasn't just a Southern Bible Belt place. It was all over America. And, you know, I think it was because a lot of people, they wanted to take the Beatles down. They thought they were becoming too popular. They were too cocky. They were now making statements about Vietnam War and about banning the bomb and all these sort of issues. And there was a backlash of conservatism. This is when Ronald Reagan was running for the California governor. And so I think that there was a backlash against the Beatles, and they used the Lennon quote to basically anchor this backlash. And as you said, it ended up with with the Beatles coming to Chicago in August '66, and he had to give a press conference where he was a little bit mealy-mouthed, but he pretty much did apologize. Yeah. And the remarkable thing about that is that I spoke to somebody who was a philanthropist, and he got a number of tickets from the promoter at face value, and then he wanted to sell them at a premium. And with the money, he's going to give to a local hospital. Right. And he couldn't sell the tickets. He ended up virtually giving them away at the end. And that signifies that it wasn't just the Southern Belt that was latching onto this, that it really did reach even into places like Chicago, New York, and, you know, some of the other, quote, liberal cities. And so, you know, it was a major event. I think it really was. And it was one of the major reasons why the Beatles stopped touring. And Lennon certainly still remembered it all throughout the 70s, up until the end. It was something he talked about, that he nearly got killed in America.
Yeah. So, you know, that press conference is kind of, it sticks with me as something that, you know, the jovial Beatles that you always see. Obviously, it was going to be less jovial with what they had to you know, speak about on that day, but if you watch some of the press conferences from in and around that time, the last American tour, there's just kind of the kind of spirit has gone out of them, and it's you know,
I totally agree.
Yeah.
If you watch the great one to watch is the first press conference they gave in New York.
Yeah.
Kennedy Airport in '64, and that was such a great press conference. That was the one where they're all on the top of their game. They were so happy to be in America. They were so excited, and you know, it was fantastic. But even by the time they got to Chicago in the summer of '64, the tone had already changed.
Yeah,
you know, even by then they were tired. They were, you know, getting fed up with the same old questions, and they were fed up also of the heat they were getting. You know, I think in Chicago more than anywhere else, but certainly even elsewhere, if you look at the journalists, most of them were men. They were middle-aged men that really didn't have much interest in the Beatles, looked down upon them, and you know, sort of, you know, if you want to say, they were like Jack Riley, you know, like the quote I gave earlier. And so I think that then carries on. But certainly by '66, the press conferences, most of them are they're pretty dour affairs. They're annoyed, you know, and they're also they were getting a little bit too annoyed with the press. I think they were antagonizing the press as much as the press was antagonizing them. You know?
Yeah. There was pushback from both.
Right, that press conference. If you see that one, it's on YouTube. It's a TV one that they gave, and then they gave a second one after that in Chicago. There's two press conferences, and that one was a little bit different. But certainly the first one is the one that is the most famous one, the one where you can really see that they've just had enough, really.
Yeah. There was another thing that you mentioned about, it was because after this '66, we started moving into the kind of counterculture that was coming about in '67 and stuff like that. And I said there wasn't going to be a quiz, but this is kind of a quiz-like question. So, and this is framed really poorly, but right. So if one is Alabama, okay, we're going to now we're talking about '67, obviously, not what we're talking about now. So if 1 is Alabama and 10 is San Francisco, where would Chicago sit on the scale of hippiedom in 1967?
2.
Really? I thought you were going to say like 5 or 6, to be honest.
I honestly think that basically, if you think about hippiedom in America, it was a West Coast phenomenon. So it's obviously San Francisco, LA, or whatever. And then it was New York. New York is the art cultural center of America, pretty obviously. And then it much, much less so in the Southern Belt, like you said. And then also not really in Chicago. I spoke to a lot of people. There was a countercultural magazine in Chicago called The Seed. And I spoke to a number of people associated with that. And they said it was still dangerous throughout the 60s, even into the 70s, to walk around Chicago with long hair. You know, you've got a chance of getting beaten up.
Yeah.
And if you ever look at any of them photos of these groups that we were talking about, the post, you know, the Shadows of Night, the Buckinghams, and all these other ones that were reasonably popular, Crying Shames. If you look at them, the musicians have got the Beatle haircut, but you look at the audience, and all the boys have got the short back and sides, all got short hair. So it wasn't a phenomenon. This hippie thing was really, and then of course the illustration of that is, if you've ever seen some of the footage of the 1968 Democratic Convention, you'll see the reaction of working class Chicago to these hippies. Yeah, because most of the police were working class, white, working class Chicago, and supporters of Mayor Daley, and they had no time whatsoever for the counterculture, these people that were unpatriotic and people that were lazy, good for nothing. You know, you can add on the swear word at the end, but that's the basic gist of it. And so when the Beatles were associated so deeply with that, I think it does affect their popularity. I think without a doubt.
Yeah, like I want to go off some, because you mentioned the convention as well, you know, and the National Capital of Police Repression. And I kind of wrote out some bits here. I hope it makes for some coherent sentences, but where undercover operatives for the police said the Beatles were funded by the entertainment section of the Communist Party, and that Paul was a member of the Young Communist League.
Yeah,
which to me was fascinating reading in your book, something I'd never heard about before. And obviously this is not true, but again, it's just trying to take down the people who are at the top of their game, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, people, you know, obviously, if you were again against the counterculture, the Beatles in '67 were kind of the centre of it, weren't they? Yeah. They really were, Sergeant Pepper, and there was a sort of growing counter, like I said, the Seed newspaper. There was a couple of venues in Chicago that were, you know, associated with the counterculture, and Mayor Daley just didn't have any time for any of it. You know, he sued the Seed newspaper. He shut down some of these venues for different reasons, you know, some of it minor. And one of the most you know, famous or funny ones was the first time, you know, most of your listeners probably know that John and Yoko brought out an album called The Two Virgins.
Yeah. And
they decided it was a great idea to have a picture of both of them naked on the front cover. And, you know, whatever you think of nudity,
yeah,
you know, it's there. Yeah. But anyway, so a lot of people in Chicago didn't like this. And of course, the Chicago police didn't like it when one of these countercultural stores put up a photo from that cover, because the cover in America, they actually, it was in a brown paper bag to cover up the nudity. Mm-hmm. You weren't even allowed to see the cover. But basically, they put up this postcard in the picture in their store, and the store was raided, and there were 2 arrested for obscenity.
Yeah.
So, and that was the first time it happened in America. Then after that, New Jersey then confiscated some of their albums, John and Yoko's albums, and went elsewhere. But that was the first time that people were brought to court over the John and Yoko cover, and it just happened to be in Chicago. Well, not it just happened. I think there was a reason. It was because Mayor Daley was so much against the counterculture, he was looking for it everywhere.
I mean, the music-wise, it probably did people a favor, because they're not the greatest work by John Lennon or Yoko, I would say, but I understand, yeah, that kind of trying to shut things down, and still, you know, you don't think of it as well. People probably would think of it as a very long time ago, but you know, it's not in the grand scheme of things, not a very long time ago. There was kind of a sad kind of end to the book, because obviously you're going to be talking about the Beatles breaking up, and if you're a big fan of the Beatles, it's a sad story, but a quiet end to the Beatles, as you mentioned, in a lot of the magazines and newspapers.
Yeah, again, you kind of, I've read so much about the breakup of the Beatles, and they always, not everybody, but a lot of people seem to then write a sentence saying headlines around the world.
Yeah.
You always see that the breakup of the Beatles have grabbed headlines around the world. And I thought, well, let's have a look at this. And I started to look at the newspapers in America. It never grabbed headlines in America, and it didn't in the rest of the world. And I think that was because by then, this was April 1970, you know, it did grab the headline, obviously, in the Daily Mirror. We all know that one. But it was basically in like page 15. Tucked into some other local news in most newspapers, because it just wasn't that big of news.
Yeah.
And I do think, partly it's because it was, you know, it wasn't that clear that the Beatles had broke up, but generally it was. And I think the reason is because the Beatles were just not the headline news that they were in 64, 65, 66. And you can see that. You can, you know, if you look at the newspapers in Chicago or anywhere else, the coverage on the Beatles wanes. If you look at Rolling Stone magazine, you know, which was the sort of the real sort of, you know, rock countercultural magazine, they were on virtually every cover in 68. You know, well, I actually counted them. It was actually every other cover, believe it or not. Right. But if you go into 69, barely half a dozen.
Yeah.
They were not as big in 69. And I think one of the reasons for that also is because, yes, some people were fed up with them because they didn't like the counterculture. They wanted the old Beatles. But I think the other reason is, if you think about 64, what really did the Beatles have as rivals?
Yeah.
Musical rivals, really. I mean, you could say Bob Dylan, obviously, but, you know, Dave Clark 5.
Yeah.
Herman's Hermits. You know, you couldn't really. Peter and Gordon.
Yeah.
By 1969, obviously now you've got all the sort of like the Joni Mitchell, the Neil Young, you've got the Led Zeppelin, you've got the Stones are now really getting into their peak in 69. And of course, the Beatles hadn't toured for 3 years. You know, they stopped touring in August 66. Now the Stones toured in 69. They had their own lighting, they had their own sound, they had their own stage show. Mm-hmm. It was a completely different thing, live music. And of course, Woodstock.
Of course, yeah.
That already happened. And that then meant that if you wanted to be at the center of the music industry in 69, 70, you really had to be a live act.
Yeah.
Really, so much of it is based now around these pop festivals. And look at Led Zeppelin. They built the whole reputation in America on their live shows. They just toured so much. And the Beatles, they were stuck in a studio.
If I have my quietest year and I release Abbey Road, I will be a very happy man. I mean, it just goes to show the quality was still there, but you're right. Like even then, isn't it? Yeah, of course.
Of course, Abbey Road was enormously popular. You know, and people always say that. You know, well, the late albums were very popular, but that's because people were buying more albums in general.
Yeah,
you know, the album sales went up in the 60s. You know, but if you look at the Beatles' major singles, you know, they really were the early ones.
Yeah.
Okay, Hey Jude. But really, it was. I mean, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. It really was those early ones that were the major ones. So the market had changed from singles to albums. And the album market was just dominated then becoming dominated by those big acts that were appearing.
Yeah, and genres expanding as well, which is another big thing. Yeah. But so, John, what do you like to do in your spare time?
I don't have any. I spend all my time writing books about the Beatles. So I have very little spare time.
Well,
no, sorry.
Just go off the back of that, because you could continue the answer. But my next question was going to tie in with that anyway. So what have you got, like, books in the pipeline then?
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, when you do a book like this on the Beatles, and I got so much material that I couldn't put into the book, you know, stuff that I realized later was no good for the book. And my editor realized by putting a red pen through it all and sticking it, you know, throwing it out the book. So I had a lot of material left over. And also when I do any sort of project like this, I do keep a pretty wide lens. You know, you see things that look very interesting, but aren't necessarily associated with the book. So anyway, basically what I'm going to do next is, believe it or not, this is a local history of the Beatles, how they were received in Chicago, a community study, if you want to say, for the Beatles. I'm now actually going to do more of a global one.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to look at how the Beatles developed politically and how they were received in other parts of the world.
See, John, I've never read a book like that. And that's exciting because I've read a good number of Beatles books. I wouldn't be able to think of how many, but yeah, from that point of view, I haven't read anything.
No, I mean, that is one of the big sort of gaps that everybody
Yeah.
says. It's like over 2,000 Beatles books out there. What more is there to say? And there's so much more to say. I think that's a nonsense but I think what people are thinking about is Beatles biography. The story of, quote, the four Beatles. And of course, Mark Lewison's doing that, and that's fine, But what we need now is we need to sort of like think a bit more widely about the Beatles story and about, like I say, how they were received elsewhere. I've been reading about doing some research on that Philippines concert that is a famous one. Actually, if you read into that, though, that story is a lot different than the one we have. There is if you want to say, an anti-colonial attitude in a lot of these countries because the Beatles are spreading British and Western influence.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people in the Philippines, they were very disappointed with the Beatles because they felt that they disrespected them.
Yeah.
And I think you'll find that again, India is a classic example. We do know a bit more about India, but South America, you never read anything about what the people in South America thought of the Beatles. And again, there's so many great stories there. I mean, really, that I've come across. So anyway, yeah, I think that there's a lot more we can do. And again, even things like, the women have not got enough coverage in the story, pretty obviously. That is something, Mark Lewison's book is very much based on the four Beatles. And I know he's obviously going to introduce the women into it, but his book is very much a biography. And I think what we need is, in addition to that, is thinking with a wider lens about the Beatles.
And that's what the Beatles fans kind of want. Mark Lewison, obviously, of course, because Mark Lewison, they're must reads because of the how expansive they are. Well, how expansive the first one was, anyway. But the idea that there's newer stuff for us to learn. That's what we want with whatever we're into. It's very exciting. John, you've been a genuine pleasure to have on the podcast.
No, it's a pleasure to be here, Derek.
I appreciate it. Listen, John, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just finish out this little bit here. We'll take a quick photo for the archives, and then we'll get on to our days, because you've got more of your day left than I have.
You want a photo of me?
Of course. I've taken a big video of you now, John.
This is going to do for your publicity, but we'll go with it. Then.
Skyrocket it, John. Skyrocket. That's what's going to do.
Say it itself, but...
Okay. Listen, I also have to thank John Francis for doing the technical work for me. I always thank my mum, my dad, my granddad, and Jaron Calvin for the graphics and the music, as always. Subscribe to our YouTube if you would. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can find John over on Twitter, actually, John F. Lyons, for more news. And also we're on Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Google Podcasts, etc. John's book is available wherever you get your books. It's called Joy and Fear, the Beatles Chicago and the 1960s. And John, once again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Derek. I'll just mention one last thing, and that is I'm doing actually a speaking tour. And of course, I don't know if this will be of much use to most of your listeners, but it's in the Chicago area, and it's to celebrate 60 years of the Beatles. And whenever I do these tours, they've been very successful. We have audiences up to like 100 people showing up, and it's not me, it's the Beatles. They want to hear that, obviously. But at the end of the talks, I always get a question answer session, and one of the questions they always ask me is, who's your favorite Beatle? And I'm kind of disappointed, Derek. You never asked me that.
Do you know, I'm disappointed in myself, to be honest. Who is your favorite Beatle?
Well, I'm not going to answer now because
do you know what my favorite Beatle is? Have a guess.
Oh, looking at you as I do, you've got to be a Paul McCartney, man. Sure.
Oh, it's George Harrison.
What?
Yeah, I love George.
Down as a George Harrison, man.
Really? I'm going to say you're a Paul McCartney. Yeah, I thought.
I don't know. Is it that obvious?
No, I was going to say, did you say that in the book or allude to it in the book? No,
I probably should have done. No, when people ask me, I always say to them, I can't, because the Beatles, it was all about the Beatles. It was about all four of them.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And I don't even like much of their solo work. I know people are going crazy at home now listening to this, but I don't. I'm not really a big solo Beatles man. I'm not really a Paul McCartney solo. There's so much other great stuff out there, you know. But it's about the four Beatles. So I'm always reluctant to say, but there is something I kind of admire a bit more about Paul McCartney, not so much musically, but as a person. And, you know, that in some ways, he's admirable in the sense that he does try to sort of maintain not just the image, but I think he really generally tries to maintain the ordinary man sort of view. You know, he tries to be down to earth. He lived a relatively, or has lived a relatively, not Spartan life, but certainly not extravagant life.
Yeah.
And he does care about the world around him. I'm always surprised when I see people that are right wing, you know, whatever, talk about how much they like the Beatles. They obviously don't know anything about them if they read it. Because if you, you know, if you read anything that the Beatles said all the way through, you know, right up until today, they obviously are very much on the liberal side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Politics. Yeah. And I also admire Paul, but plus Ringo, because I think they've changed people's view of old age.
I agree.
You know, when we were young, you know, basically what happened is you retired at 65 and then you died.
Yeah.
And if you lived on for a year or two, you know, you were stuck in the corner and, you know, the family would ignore you. But there's these two people out there, they're touring, they're creative, they're, you know, making the best of their life, they're enjoying themselves. And I think that they really have been an inspiration in that respect.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I do think I would have to put probably Paul McCartney.
That's fair. And fittingly for an episode with an author, we had an epilogue at the end. And I'm delighted to say, John, once again, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again, Derek.
And everybody else for watching, thank you so much. And we will chat to you next week. Take care. Bye.